Before we get started, I just want to let you know that you do not need to take notes for this presentation, and this is just giving you a lot of information about the Revolutionary War and the Declaration of Independence. You do not need to know everything that I am telling you. You don't need to remember it for the test. You are going to have a document of your notes on Google Classroom, and the stuff on your notes document is what you're going to need to study for the test. So you do not need to remember everything that I'm telling you in this presentation. I'm just giving you a lot of information so you have the full story and background knowledge about what happened. Again, you will need to study what's on Google Classroom under notes. So what was the Revolutionary War? It was fought from April of 1775 to September of 1783, and it's known as the American War for Independence. And prior to the war, the 13 American colonies were owned by the British. Those who lived here were British citizens and were under the complete control of the British Crown, or in other words, the British government. American colonists strongly opposed this amount of control, especially since Great Britain tried to rule over the colonies from thousands of miles away. And this was done through taxation without representation, commerce, laws, and lack of representation/rights. We will get into all of these later in the presentation, so don't worry if you don't understand what those words mean just yet. The American colonies rose up against the British military and fought for independence from the British Crown. The Revolutionary War ended with the British and Americans signing the Treaty of Paris, which recognized America's independence from Britain, and it's also known as the birth of our nation as we know it today. So, if you haven't already, I want you to pause this video and go to Google Classroom, and under your to-do list, you will see these two links, A Brief History of American Independence Part 1 and 2. You're not able to access these links through this video, and I apologize for that. But I do want you, if you haven't already, go watch these videos and then come back to the presentation. So the lead up to the revolution. Colonial life was difficult. Colonists had no form of government representation, and they were forced to abide by all laws created by the British government. They were considered British citizens and had all of their income taxed, and it went to England. And getting necessary food and supplies all depended on the British trade boats and one's ability to be self-sustainable. This is important because Britain tried to control hundreds of people who lived in the New World from thousands of miles away. They tried to make all of the rules be abided by these people, and it was just really difficult because the colonists didn't understand why they needed to abide by all of the rules from when the government was thousands of miles away. Taxation without representation. This is a phrase that refers to a population of individuals, like the colonists, who are forced to pay taxes to a government, Great Britain, that doesn't allow them to have a say in government policies. So the example, the British government forced colonists to abide by all British laws, but wouldn't allow any colonists to become government officials. This wasn't fair because the colonists felt like that all of their money was basically being stolen by the British government because they were not able to be representatives in their government. The colonists wanted to be able to be represented by their peers, which we have now in our government. And this issue of representation becomes a major reason for the Revolutionary War. The British acts of aggression. So before the Revolutionary War, it's important to understand the events that led up to it. So King George III, the King of England, had a large war debt to pay off when he took over the British throne. He decided to try to pay off this debt by taxing the 13 colonies through official acts of parliament, which really makes sense because he was trying to make money to pay off this war debt, and because he did own the colonies, it does make sense that he tried to pay off this debt by taxing the colonies and the people there. But this wasn't fair because, like I said before, there was taxation without representation. So the people of the colonies didn't feel like it was fair because they weren't being represented in government. So this started with the Sugar Act of 1764. This was a tax on refined sugar, so like granulated sugar and brown sugar like you'd use in your kitchen, from the British sugar plantations in the West Indies. And you can see this map of the West Indies right here. The West Indies is also known as the Caribbean. This tax was also collected on indigo, coffee, wines, and textiles, or in other words, clothing, but it's known altogether as the Sugar Act. There was also the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and the Tea Act. So the Stamp Act took place in February of 1765, and it was basically a tax on all paper documents in the colonies. So any communication that colonists wanted to have with each other had to be taxed pretty expensively, and all that money would go to the government. The Townshend Acts were between 1767 and 1768, and it was a series of acts that further taxed the colonists, leading to more colonial unrest and protest. So Townshend Acts, what they were taxing specifically was not super important. It's just the fact that there were more taxes being added on to the taxes that were already there. The Tea Act of 1773, it wasn't another tax that went straight to the colonists per se, but it bailed out the East India Company, which was owned by Great Britain. East India Company was a super well-known and successful company that basically moved a lot of the tea in the world to different places, and it allowed a monopoly on tea to be created. So the Tea Act basically allowed the East India Company to be the only company that would give or would bring people tea. And right here, there is a political cartoon of the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, and the Sugar Act, and how people felt about it. So these tensions ended up escalating to acts of aggression, and this was really started with the Boston Massacre, and that's on March 5th of 1770. You've probably heard about this before, but I'm going to go into a little more detail about it. So in the fall of 1768, 3,000 uniformed British troops arrived to occupy Boston, Massachusetts. The king was starting to get worried because a lot of the colonists were starting to display some anger toward Great Britain, and so the king decided he would bring troops in to try to quell all of this, all of these feelings. So almost 2 years later, after the uniformed officers came to occupy Boston, on March 5th, 1770, a crowd of colonists taunted 8 British soldiers. So the stories are a little, there are different stories about this, but it's been told that colonists threw snowballs and rocks at soldiers and made fun of them. Some of them dared the soldiers to fire their weapons. Apparently, a voice in the crowd yelled fire, and the troops shot into the crowd of people. 11 men were hit and 5 were killed. So King George actually, after a lot of outrage from the colonists, he actually did try these soldiers in a court of law, but of course they weren't found guilty because the king didn't really feel that bad about it. Next is the Boston Tea Party. I love this joke. What kind of tea did American colonists prefer? Liberty. Haha. So anyway, the Boston Tea Party happened on December 16th, 1773, and it was a political protest where a group called the Sons of Liberty dressed up as a local Native American tribe and dumped 342 chests full of tea into Boston Harbor. So this group of guys basically painted themselves as a local Indian tribe, went onto some boats in the middle of the night and dumped a bunch of tea into the Boston Harbor. And this was all to protest the fact that they were being taxed without representation. So no taxation without representation. So then there was a second round of retaliatory acts from Great Britain. The first of these were the Intolerable Acts, and these were 5 acts created by the British government in retaliation to the Boston Tea Party. So the British government was so angry at the colonists that they put these 5 acts to tax them further to get back at them. So first was the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Impartial Administration of Justice Act, the amendment to the 1765 Quartering Act, and the Quebec Act. And I do not expect you to remember these 5 acts. I just expect you to know that the Intolerable Acts were basically more fuel to the fire for the colonists to begin to think about seceding from Great Britain. So the effects of these acts. Many New England towns decided to either ignore the new laws or find ways around them. And tensions between American colonists and Great Britain continued to grow as these acts were passed. The First Continental Congress. So this took place on September 5th of 1774, and every colony except Georgia sent delegates to Philadelphia to discuss the British/American crisis, as they called it. So a delegate is essentially just a person that has been chosen to represent a group of people. So every colony sent people that they thought best represented their colony to Philadelphia to discuss the British/American crisis. So the delegates wanted to come up with a unified response to the intolerable acts. So all of these delegates came together and they wanted to come up with a response that they could send to the King of England about how these acts were not right and they shouldn't be put on them. And the outcome of this was the delegates created a declaration that stated, "We ask only for peace, liberty, and security. We demand no new rights." And Britain believed that even those rights could be considered too radical for simple colonists. So the colonists simply wanted peace, liberty, and security. They didn't want any new rights. They just didn't want to be taxed any farther, and Britain did not think that this was acceptable. So the Battle of Lexington and Concord. This took place on April 18th of 1775, and the British planned a surprise attack on an ammunition storage site in Concord, Massachusetts. This is when Paul Revere and William Dawes bravely traveled by boat and horseback to attempt to warn colonists of the impending attack. So you might have heard the quote, "The British are coming, the British are coming." And that comes from Paul Revere and the Midnight Ride, as it's called. So the British soldiers attacked colonial Minutemen, attempting to protect the ammunition storage site as well as their towns and homes. So Minutemen are essentially a group of men that are on, they are not soldiers by any means, but if something happens, they are able to pick up their weapons and be ready in a minute to defend their towns. So that's where the term Minutemen comes from. And in the end, 273 British troops were wounded or dead, and 95 Americans were killed. And the Revolutionary War officially started the next day, on April 19th, 1775. And I have this really funny slide. So the Midnight Ride, expectation versus reality, probably. The Second Continental Congress. It was assembled in Philadelphia in May of 1775 to do two things. First, it was to raise and supply an army. So on June 14th, 1775, the Continental Congress voted to create the Continental Army and chose George Washington to be commander-in-chief. So whenever I refer to the American Army or the Continental Army in this presentation, I'm meaning the same thing. The Continental Army was America's army during the Revolutionary War. And the second thing they wanted to do at the Second Continental Congress, was to try to reconcile with Britain. Because at this point, most Americans did not want to create their own country. They wanted to be British citizens. They just wanted to be treated better. So at this point, they just wanted to reconcile with Britain. They weren't ready to completely create a new country yet. Next is the Battle of Bunker Hill. This took place on June 17th, 1775. It's the second battle of the Revolutionary War, and it took place in Charlestown, Massachusetts. This was a British victory. It left 226 British soldiers dead and over 800 injured, and 140 American soldiers were dead, with 271 wounded and 30 captured. So the Olive Branch Petition took place in July in 1775. And this was really interesting because the Olive Branch Petition was a document that was sent to King George stating that the colonies were still loyal to the British Crown. So even though we were fighting against the British, we still wanted to be recognized as British citizens. We still wanted to be part of Great Britain. And this proposed that the American colonial assemblies So essentially, the 13 colonies could be recognized as individual parliaments under the British government. So if you guys remember, Parliament is essentially the Congress of the British government. So how we have our Congress now, the British government has their Parliament. So this was rejected by King George, and he condemned all Americans as traitors to England. So, I want to mention Common Sense by Thomas Paine. This was a pamphlet written by Thomas Paine, who was an Englishman and intellectual who had come over from England to America. And he argued that the divine right of kings, which is the idea that kings are chosen by God to rule. So a king, he is chosen by God to rule, and his son is also chosen by God to rule. So that's the idea of the divine right of kings. He thought this was absurd and that governments should be a republic based on the consent of the people. So kind of what our government is today. It's a republic that's based on the people and what they want. So Common Sense sold over 150,000 copies, and it helped the average American colonist understand why breaking away from Great Britain was a good thing to do. So it was essentially sold out like a newspaper, and it allowed the everyday person to kind of understand what the people in the colonies that were kind of leading this charge, what they wanted to do. And his quote, this wasn't in Common Sense, but it's a quote by him that I think encompasses what Common Sense was about. And it says, "The duty of a true patriot is to protect his country from his government." The Declaration of Independence. So, in addition to Thomas Paine's Common Sense, another factor that hastened, or in other words, quickened, the idea of independence from Britain was the idea of creating an alliance with France. So the Americans realized that by themselves, they couldn't take on Great Britain, who at the time had the biggest military in the world. So if they were going to win any sort of battles, they had to have an alliance with another country that had a bigger military. So France was willing to provide military supplies and naval power for America only if America solidified support for independence between the colonies. And if you don't know, naval power is essentially, it's the Navy, it's the military that covers the sea. So it's all of the boats and things like that. So this was only if America could get all of the 13 colonies to vote for independence and officially secede from Great Britain to become their own country. So on July 2nd, all but one state voted for independence. That was New York. Congress turned to Thomas Jefferson, who began writing a document that would eventually be known as the Declaration of Independence. After Thomas Jefferson finished writing it, Congress took some time to amend it and discuss the document until July 4th, 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was formally adopted. And you guys should recognize the date of July 4th, 1776 as our Independence Day. So this is a quote from the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, and it's super important. It's, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And these ideas were really unheard of at the time. So countries that were involved in the Revolutionary War. The American colonists, of course, and France joins the Americans in 1778 by providing naval support, like we mentioned. And Great Britain and the British also hired German Hessians to fight alongside the British Army. And German Hessians are essentially, they're just German soldiers / mercenaries that could be more manpower alongside the British Army. So the goals of the war. The Americans wanted to create a new country separate from Great Britain. The people who wanted independence were known as patriots. Their army was made up of inexperienced militias, in other words, farmers or townsfolk. Many people in the colonies still remained loyal to Britain throughout the war. These people were known as loyalists. The British wanted to regain their allegiance of the American colonists, and they did not want to destroy and conquer, so their army was often restrained. So through most of the war, the British still wanted the colonies to be a part of Great Britain, and so they really didn't unleash the full power of their armies because they didn't want to destroy the colonies. They just wanted them to surrender so they could become part of Great Britain again. So, some important battles and events of the war. By the end of 1776, the colonists had lost control of New York. George Washington had come up with a plan to take back control. So on Christmas night, in other words, December 25th, in 1776, Washington and his army stealthily crossed the Delaware River and at dawn quickly captured the unsuspecting British allies. This was a big morale and spirit booster for the Continental Army because the members of the Continental Army at this point were starting to get really run down, and they were really wondering if they were going to have a chance in this war because they were facing such a big army that the British had. The Battle of Saratoga, fall of 1777. This included two important battles. The first was Freeman's Farm, and it took place at an abandoned farm owned by John Freeman, who was a loyalist. Both sides lost a lot of men when the Americans were forced to retreat. And the second battle was the Battle of Bemis Heights. This was in October of 1777, and it ended with the British surrendering to the Americans. This was a turning point for the war because it boosted the morale of the Patriots and persuaded the French to provide naval support for the Continental Army. The end of the war. The Battle of Yorktown was the last official battle of the Revolutionary War, and it took place in October of 1781. The American Army and the French Navy trapped British forces on the Yorktown Peninsula, forcing them to surrender. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Paris, which was signed on September 3rd of 1783, and it was the American and the British officials who signed this treaty in Paris, France.